Hi, I'm Kirk Haines, and welcome to Chicago Crystal.
Hi, Kirk. Welcome to Chicago Crystal. I am super excited to have you on. I've definitely run into at least your blog posts in the Ruby community, and I think it's super interesting that you're getting into Crystal. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm super glad you're here. It's been exciting to see some people from the Ruby community discover Crystal. We have a lot of Rubyists, and I'm sure that we'll talk about it a little bit. But I'm really curious how you found Crystal. Just to kind of kick it off, though, how'd you get into programming? How'd you discover this space and get into all of this?
How did I get into programming? So when I was 11 years old, local community college where I grew up, during the summertime, they offered various sorts of enrichment type classes and stuff for kids. And one of the classes that they offered, excuse me, one of the classes that they offered was a introduction to computers and programming and stuff like that, using the VAX VMS cluster that they had just gotten.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, and so this was like the summer of 1982, I remember just loving it, printing out all kinds of documentation and going home and reading it. And so shortly after that, my parents splurged and bought an Apple II Plus.
Oh, wow.
Ostensibly, it was a family computer, but really it was my very, 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 very expensive toy. When you look at computers then cost what they cost now, but dollars then were a lot smaller. So,
yeah.
And
now, was that HyperCard time?
So that was, it was before HyperCard, I think.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that was, it was 48K, and AppleSoft Basic and 6502 assembly. And
oh, wow.
I was an expert on that machine. I mean, I knew everything about it. And that's how I got started, was an Apple II Plus that I was a guru with. And then it grew from there. I went to college at the University of Wyoming and studied computer science, but didn't graduate with a degree in computer science. However, I got a job there working for one of the offices on campus, doing basically all of their general computer stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They had an IBM RS 6000 system that they ran some database stuff on. It was Office of Environmental Health and Safety, and so they had to track hazardous chemical inventories and radioactive waste inventories and things like that for the university. And so I wrote, I think the database was FilePro actually, but I wrote some FilePro applications to calculate radioactive decay rates and stuff like that so they could figure out when things were safe to dispose of. And I got into Linux around then, like 1992.
Wow.
So it was a very, it was a very, very early Linux. Then it grew from there. By like 94, 95. I got tired of being poor and discovered that I had the skills to go get hired. And so moved to Denver and away we went.
Okay. And so, looking through some of your bio, you're from Wyoming, and just for people who, I mean, I don't know where in Denver you moved, but for those who are not as familiar with the geography of America, Wyoming is just north of Denver, right?
Yeah. So it's the least populated state. There's nobody here. And I'm north of Denver. The town with the university in Wyoming is about 2 hours north of Denver. So, yeah.
Okay. And so you moved to Denver, and you have, definitely some assembly knowledge from the Apple II Plus, and then have done some database work, so real application work, some like detecting or calculating decay,
Yeah.
and you also are kind of on the what I would call the bleeding edge of Linux and that
Oh
revolution.
yeah.
So when you
Oh yeah.
moved to Denver, what were you doing, and how did
Um,
that kind of
so
play into
so
getting in the industry?
I got a job as on a technical support help desk for U.S. West, who was the Baby Bell company, the phone company at the time.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and so the division of U.S. West, where all of the engineers worked, all of the folks that designed all of the phone systems, they the entire engineering force did all of their work on Sun Spark stations.
Oh
And
man, no way.
so internally, they had a technical support help desk just to support all of those Sun systems on engineers' desks and the whole engineering department then. And so I hired on, as a tier two technical support person for them, and did that for 8 months, something like that. And then transitioned, it was a contract position,
Mhm.
transitioned from there to a full time employee for US West doing systems administration.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, I mean, that seems to kind of fit in with the previous experience you had. I mean, going from that's a good path.
Yeah.
How how did you like working? I'm fascinated with telecoms. I was not in the industry when before the dot com bubble, but also just like in the expansion of all that stuff. But I love learning about it, and I love kind of talking to people about the. I mean, this is the Baby Bells is maybe not the origin of the internet, but I mean, is this an era where people are kind of
Oh,
coming
yeah.
online? And you're breaking those 100,000 million kind of people with email and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. When I was started there, that was right after the first, uh, first real web browser came out, and the internet was
Oh no
really
way!
starting to become more than just like Gopher and um,
Yeah.
you could telnet and FTP to various places. I've been involved with some internet BBSs since like
Yeah.
late 89, 90. That you telnet to them.
Yep.
So that was like the original internet social network was internet BBSs that you would telnet to. Um, and so then when I started at US West, things had evolved some. We had websites and, NCSA Mosaic,
Yep. Yeah.
that early browser. Um, and, it was interesting, working for a company like that. Um, they had lots of money. And so
Hmm.
there were lots of very expensive toys. You know, the server
Yeah.
room was just full of hardware, and every engineer had a Spark station on their desk, um, and so it was a lot of it was a really useful learning experience because there was exposure to a whole bunch of things, a lot of different software, a lot of different low level operating system type stuff that you had to deal with.
Yep. Yep.
It was really, I think, a great sort of introduction to the industry because there was a lot of stuff to learn from.
Yeah, I bet. This is kind of interesting, but you're talking about working for what was a prestigious company, Baby Bell at the time, and they had um, things that people didn't really have access to. I mean, Spark stations were, I believe, normally commercially available, but they were expensive, and
Yeah,
there's a
they were.
lot of
Yeah,
yeah. Um,
yeah,
just from reading about it, they seemed expensive, and also there's a ton of telecommunications equipment that people normally couldn't have access to. You didn't have access to some of these more advanced, kind of pieces of computing machinery. And now, as an engineer, most of the things that I work on are very readily commercially available. I
hmm
mean, I work on MacBooks. I own, you know, I have running this off of a PC that I built that's running Linux, and like there's a lot of this is very commercially available. If you want to set up a home lab, I feel like that's very accessible. I mean, you can get more into expensive components and things like that, but with virtualization and the way that everyone's going these days, it's kind of interesting. I mean, back in like I'd be interested if what companies are out there that like, I mean, there are expensive kind of pieces of computing machinery out there, but it's so much of this industry has become the things that we work on are very accessible now.
Yeah, they're commodities now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a radical idea back then to think about doing that kind of computation, that kind of work on commodity systems. I mean, back then, at home, I ran a Linux system, and at one point in time, I seriously considered trying to start an ISP running off of Linux systems.
Yeah.
But that was kind of a radical, risky idea. People did not see, you're going to run on a PC with Linux when, why aren't you going to run on Solaris? Why aren't you going to
Yeah.
run on Sun? And even like database stuff,
Oh man.
MSQL was a database product that preceded MySQL.
Yeah.
And, when MySQL first came out, MySQL was a lot like MSQL. They were related products, and it was a very, very simple database system, but it worked for a lot of your basic needs. And back then, Oracle was the 800-pound gorilla in the database space, and so even as you got into the later 90s, when MySQL was getting a little bit more established, if you were doing business, it was still seen as kind of risky to be looking at using MySQL instead of Oracle.
Yeah, man, how things have moved in the computer industry. I mean,
It's amazing.
It's so amazing. I think database technology is something that I've started a few database books about like database engines or things like that, and I haven't finished them because I have a lot of other priorities. But it is probably it's one of the pillars that has kind of moved the computing industry forward, and it is just amazing how much data we store now, and even just relational databases. And I mean, the really interesting things that are going on. I mean, we see just advancement after advancement, and I don't know, it just enables so much. I love the idea of Cockroach DB, and I've been playing with it a little bit, just with the concerns I've seen in a few companies I've worked for with regulations and scale and distribution, or like distributed systems and stuff. I find it fascinating. I mean, I can't recommend it because I've only used it as a like in example projects and stuff like that. But it's really cool. Have you heard of that?
I'm not familiar with Cockroach DB now.
It's wire compatible with Postgres, and it's built by some ex-Googlers that try to take kind of Postgres concepts and make them like geo location aware, so you can like kind of pin data to certain regions like the EU or something like that. And then it has some really advanced features just with querying and replication, and just it seems extremely quick and interesting, and it's kind of cloud native. It's kind of Postgres for Kubernetes and cloud native, and
interesting
kind of stuff. Yeah, databases are fascinating.
Oh yeah,
but yeah. So how did you get from the Baby Bell to kind of where you are now into Crystal?
Yeah. So it's funny because even though I was working as a systems administrator, at my core, I was really a programmer, and so while I was working for US West, I also wrote various software systems that we used internally. Actually, the neatest project that I think I did that went absolutely nowhere was right after Java 1.0 came out. I was all over Java. Java was a fascinating thing, and I had this heretical idea: what if you could take HTML forms, and you could implement them with Java UI components. But then what if you also were able to wire up those Java UI components to the CGI protocol in a way that not only could you make a CGI request, but that the data that was returned from the server could alter your components, could alter what was on
Interesting.
your screen without a page reload. Basically, so what I did is I wrote a whole Java applet that could take an HTML form and render it using Java UI components in your web
Oh, interesting.
server. But then it had bidirectional communication with your server. So it wasn't JavaScript, it was Java. But
Yeah.
basically I invented, the whole way that web applications work right now. Um, I did it with Java 1.0 as a toy, and then didn't do anything with it, and you know, nothing happened with it. It was like, oh, this is really cool. I wrote a few applications. It was really cool. You could click on things and stuff would just change on your screen, and no page reloads or anything like that. And little did I know that that's the direction the internet was going to go some years later.
Or
Yeah,
maybe you knew.
yeah. But what happened is that I was working for US West
Yeah.
for a while, and then I, through the grapevine, found out about a small company in Denver that was hiring developers, and I applied as a software developer and got hired, and started doing Perl. And I had already been writing a lot of stuff in Perl. I had been learning Perl for a while, so I started doing Perl professionally, though, at that point in time.
Yeah.
And I did Perl for a number of years, for a few different companies, both in the Denver area and a startup in San Jose.
Okay.
And it was actually, I was 2000 and it was 2001. It was right around the time of Ruby 166. Um, I
Oh
read
man.
about I read about Ruby in a Perl magazine of all things, and
Oh, interesting.
I thought, wow, this looks like a better Perl than Perl. And so what I did is I took a whole bunch of my Perl code and I rewrote it in Ruby, and I just compared them side by side. It's just like, how do they look? How do they function? How does this feel? And by and large, it was an experience where my Ruby code, in almost all cases, was both shorter and more readable than my Perl code. Um, and I was sold. It's like, okay, I'm going to start writing Ruby now.
Yeah, I mean, both of those shorter and more readable. Man, Ruby crushed it compared to Perl in that. They still inherited a lot of the Perlisms too. So
Oh yeah,
if you wanted to dip down into some of the constants, for example, or things like that, like I mean, they really carry over a lot too.
yeah. There's a ton of Perlisms. Yeah, and those have slowly been weeded out or deprecated, even if they aren't actually gone from the language. But
Yeah.
back in those days, especially the Perlisms were still in heavy use.
This is kind of an interesting topic because I have read a lot about the dominance of Java and C++. And if you look at kind of the charts of languages, you don't really see Perl like kind of, consistently, like I don't even think it broke the top 5 in some cases. But I know so many Perl developers from that era. And it's almost a language that people don't talk about as much, at least in kind of the blog posts and circles that I've been through, except for the Ruby community. But it seems to have been massively influential.
Oh yeah. Well, if you were doing web stuff,
Yeah.
back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you were pretty much either doing it in Perl or in PHP.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah. Wasn't CGI or isn't it Common Gateway Interface or something like that?
yeah,
That comes from Perl. And for those who don't know, it's kind of like the rack of Perl, I guess is like a good analogy.
yeah. I mean, it was a protocol specification for how to communicate between a server, how to communicate with a server using HTTP,
Yeah.
and get responses back. And yeah, it was what the internet was built on, was CGI.
Yeah.
You had your forms that would communicate with your CGI servers, and they would receive that request and return a response. And that's the way the internet was built.
Yeah. I hilariously, I've only used Perl to parse things and like do forms and other stuff like that. Like I found it very nice for doing that specific task, and I've only used it in a very limited capacity. But I've actually never built a Perl site.
Yeah,
I've only done it to basically rip through data. Like
yeah.
that's it. I'm not sure it was the best tool for the job, but it was the one I had. So
Well, I still use Perl sometimes, but the only thing that I use it for is one-liners, usually to
oh yeah,
edit files.
yep, yep.
I use it as a glorified awk. Yeah,
Not bad. I mean, oh man, I like awk, but that's a whole other. It's really hard to remember. I can never remember that. Yeah. So how did you get from like so you're doing Perl at the time? You've switched over to not switched over, but you've discovered Ruby, and then this is yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. So basically, what ended up happening is that in oh golly, yeah, it was around 2002. I started doing independent freelance consulting, and
Okay.
I was doing. I actually got hooked up with one of the guys that ran the startup that I worked for in San Jose had a business doing software for real estate companies, and I got hooked up with him, working with him, but then he went off to do something else, and I kind of took that over, and it migrated and mutated into a business that was doing websites primarily for mutual fund companies. And I started doing all of them in Ruby.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, this was, the first one. Well, actually, the first Ruby application that I wrote was a website for the Milwaukee Chamber of Commerce. They wanted a site to allow them to match college interns with companies looking for interns. So it was a job
Oh
site
man,
for internships.
that's such a Chamber of Commerce thing.
Yeah. And so I built for the Milwaukee Chamber of Commerce. I built this entire application to do. It was a job search site. It was Monster
Yeah.
for internships. And yeah, that was 2002 that I built that in Ruby.
Okay. And then
2002. Yeah.
you kind of started getting full into Ruby, right? At this point.
Oh yeah, I was. Yeah, everything I did was Ruby. I was building site after site after site in Ruby. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen some of the work that you've done just going through your GitHub repo with like scrawls and like Iowa, where you really kind of investigated some more technical and deeper parts of Ruby, or just more complex parts.
Yeah, Iowa was so. When I was first getting into really diving into the idea of using Ruby for all of this web work, one of the first thoughts was, okay, so what exists in the Ruby ecosystem for building websites and doing that sort of thing? And at that point in time, the answer was not a lot.
Oh wow.
And what did exist was, pretty basic. However, I tripped over this proof of concept that Avi Bryant had written. And, some people might recognize that name. He's done a bunch of stuff in Smalltalk. But before he really embraced Smalltalk, fully, he did some Ruby stuff, and he did some interesting Ruby stuff. And he had done this proof of concept for a web framework. And he called it Iowa, Internet Objects for Web Applications.
Oh,
And
I didn't know that's what that stood for.
yeah. And when I started playing with it, it resonated with me. It was like, oh, this is fantastic. This makes so many things so easy. And so by the time that I had discovered it, it was basically abandoned. He had moved on from his proof of concepts, and he had moved on. And so, I contacted him and got permission to kind of take over development on it, and I hacked on it and turned it into something that I could use in production to build websites. And it was just it made so many things so easy that I started building everything with it.
Interesting. And there's one thing in Iowa that I wasn't too sure about. I figured to ask you about, but what does it do? Or like, how does it handle ORMs? You do have models a few times in here, but oh yeah, go ahead.
So when Iowa was originally a thing, basically there wasn't there weren't any ORMs for Ruby at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as it happened, Avi had also written a proof of concept for an ORM for Ruby that he called Kansas. Because, we had Iowa, so we may as well have another state, I guess.
Yeah.
And like I did with Iowa, I took it over and I turned it into something that I could use in production. And so basically, I used Kansas as the ORM, and Kansas wasn't an active record type of ORM. It used the database as your source of truth, and then it mapped the database schema to the Ruby side.
Okay.
So rather than Ruby dictating what was in the database dictated what was in Ruby.
Interesting.
But from a usability standpoint, it worked great for all of the kind of stuff that I was doing. And it was built so that when you were doing, querying your database or whatever, you actually did it with Ruby code. And the Ruby code was turned into SQL that then was ran on the database. And so that's basically the stack that I developed. I can't even tell you how many. Dozens and dozens of sites and applications for more than just financial companies, but mostly financial companies.
Okay. Wow, it's a stack that I haven't heard much about, but it seems really cool. I'd love to.
I was terrible at marketing.
There is a fascinating thing where sometimes there's really great ideas and I believe really good software, but getting the word out there is hard. It's hard to really to sell people on sometimes what are very good ideas. I've had to learn this just in my professional career, that sometimes when I come to a meeting with an idea, it is worthwhile to do a longer preparation and come up with what will be perceived questions and be able to respond and kind of how to pitch something. It's a skill.
It's definitely a skill, and it's a difficult skill. It's a skill I'm still learning. But but I was definitely I was terrible at the whole marketing and how do you generate excitement, and then how do you cultivate that excitement into participation and stuff like that. I was terrible at it. And so, there were some people that used Iowa, there were some people that used Kansas, but not tons.
Yeah. I think this is something that like just the Crystal community is like kind of is really stepping up into, but I think the fastest C, slick as Ruby, or slick as Ruby, fastest C.
Yeah.
The ordering, I can't remember. It has been a good kind of like guiding mantra for development, but it doesn't really spark excitement. And I got excited with the language when I started using it, but it was not something that the messaging pitch has been. I think people come from Ruby and they're like, well, it's faster, but like I don't really need the speed or something like that. And then I feel that the predictability, the consistency of code, the help from the compiler, the clarity on what's happening. Like there's a lot of things about it that I like, but it is one of those things that is somewhat hard to boil down into a tagline. And I'm not really the developer happiness. Man, Ruby nailed it. That is such a good pitch, and it matches with the kind of ethos and the direction that Ruby has had.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to remember exactly when it was that I first heard about Crystal. It was at a conference. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was at Ruby Kaigi. I haven't gone back and looked at the programs for the years that I was there. So I don't know if it was like at Ruby Kaigi in 2016 or if maybe it was at RubyConf in 2015. I don't remember, but it was at a conference. And I remember thinking, oh, this sounds really cool. And then I went and looked at it, and it was one of those things where it was fairly early still in the development.
Yep.
And
Yep.
when I went and looked at it, it was like, oh, this is really cool, but there's not. I don't see an advantage here. There's not a lot I can do. It's still pretty, it's pretty early.
Yeah.
And so I didn't actually, I kind of looked at it, but I didn't really give it much additional consideration at the time. And it wasn't
Yeah.
until this year that I came back to it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you just came back to this year?
Oh, yeah.
Well, maybe we can jump forward a little bit to that. We can definitely go back and chat a little bit more about your Ruby days. I'm really interested in some. I think you started jumping on a little bit of Ruby maintenance, so I'd be really curious.
Yeah.
We'll chat about that maybe a little bit later. But so you found Crystal earlier this year. Kind of like, how'd you find it? I'm really interested in kind of an unprompted take. Not seeding it too much of what were your kind of thoughts and stuff like that coming into it.
Well,
So
it was sort of just one of those things that it was almost random. I tripped across a reference, might have been on Twitter, talking about Crystal, and I thought, well, let's go take a look at it again. And I went and I looked at it, and it seemed so much more evolved and so much more solid. And I started just playing with it. And I actually, what I did is, after I played with it a little bit and realized that it was just, it was so much more evolved from when it was, the first time I looked at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started getting a feeling for just how fast code that is written in Crystal runs. I thought, I'm going to go try and rewrite some of my existing code in Crystal. And basically, it was surprisingly easy to do.
Yeah.
And the results were great. And I really enjoyed the experience of working in Crystal. The typing is the single biggest hurdle to a Rubyist coming to Crystal. There's so many things that just work as a Rubyist when you come to Crystal.
Yeah.
And there's lots of little places where you run into stumbling blocks. But the typing is like the single biggest hurdle. But once that starts to click, it flows just like Ruby. I mean, it's as easy to use, it's as pleasant to use. And I found when I was translating some of my Ruby code, I found some bugs that I didn't know existed because of
Yep.
the type handling stuff. And so I got very, very good feelings from it and got very excited by it very quickly.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, my excitement level was high, but I was kind of sold on it. It's interesting to hear that the typing caught bugs and the typing was a barrier. And I think I think that's a really good kind of insight and like something that I've kind of heard people talk a little bit around the edges. But yeah, I mean, the coming from Ruby, you definitely have to start thinking in types a little bit. But catching bugs happened for me too, and I love that part of it.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things. The type inference in Crystal is really, surprisingly good most of the time. So there's a lot of places where you can write your code just like Ruby. And in fact, there are times when you can write your code just like Ruby, even when you shouldn't be writing it just like Ruby.
Yep.
And it just works. But when you do run into those places where you need to focus on the typing, when you have that Ruby mindset of you can throw anything, and as long as it behaves properly, the code will just work. And now suddenly you have to think about, okay, is it a string? Is it a number? What is it? Yeah, that mental shift, it can take a little bit of time, but for me it was a couple of days of while I was working on translating my code that I was like repeatedly running into these things that were frustrating until suddenly things started to click, and it's like, oh, okay, now we're good. I've got this. So it wasn't a huge hurdle, but it was a hurdle that existed.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. There have been some moments in Crystal that I find the compiler super advanced and think it's interesting that it's through some typing stuff it's caught certain things. There was one thing in like an if statement that like, one kind of block and an else, like something was being caught that couldn't have been called. And it was like really interesting how it
Yeah.
could take union types. And I mean, it's not just like a type system in like the Java way or whatever. It's like almost like a type management system. Like it's just managing all the types for you.
Mm-hmm.
It is a type system, but some things have been super impressive. I really like what it's really corrected or caught for me. I find that I trust my Crystal code more because of it, because I find it to be more predictable.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that struck me, when I started using Crystal was that for the most part, once your program compiles, it works.
Yeah.
Barring the stupid logic errors and things like that, once it compiles, it works, or it's very close to working. It's not
Yep.
like, okay, it ran, but everything was garbage. If it runs, you're probably pretty close to having something that is what you intended. And that was a really pleasant outcome.
Yeah, I really like that. I 100% agree with you. I think what's also really interesting is they've some of the people on the compiler have changed a little bit how the errors worked, and I think the lucky folks have been able to make some really good error handling messages, and they can kind of direct you or
Yeah.
kind of interpret what you're doing and be like, hey, we see you did this, like check out this documentation or look at this, or this could be a problem. And it's really fascinating using the compiler kind of like Elm to help you along, but also just like there's some provability that what you call like a function or whatever will be there and stuff like that. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, the vast majority of the time, when with the exceptions, the error messages that the compiler provides are very clear and specific, and you can just look at it and
Yep.
here's my mistake, and now I'm going to go fix it. Every once in a while you run into things where because of the way the code compiles and everything, the error messages might not be completely clear, but it's not super common.
Yeah, 100% agree. Coming as a Rubyist, there was like one of my first projects I was building in Crystal, and I just find this funny at this point. But I had done what I thought was correct, like changed a controller, and it was sitting in the browser, like reloading, and it wasn't updating. So like the code hadn't, it was not showing the new code.
Right.
I was sitting there like wondering what's going on, killed the server, restarted it, like did all this kind of stuff. And I wasn't reading the compiler output, and the compiler output was like, this is not correct. And it was telling me the problem, but it's so interesting. There are certain flows just as a Rubyist that are, I believe a little bit lazy on my part that like, you change something and a page breaks, you just kind of know, oh, it's a thing I changed, and you just look at it and you have to try to figure it out. But with Crystal, sometimes it just will be like this, it won't compile, be like, this is the problem.
Yeah.
It's interesting coming to Crystal. So when you were building your first project in Crystal, how did your flows change? Like what did you kind of, both maybe get from the language and also maybe lost from coming from Ruby?
Well, the big change was just dealing with, well, the compiler step, the compilation step, and realizing that one of the aha moments was realizing that I don't have to actually compile my code to do most of what I used to do. In Ruby, you make a change, you go run it, you wait for something to break, and then it's like, okay, that broke, so you go make another change and you run it, and you wait for something to break. And so with Crystal, because you have to get the compilation part right first, you can't do that in the same way. And I guess one of the compilation for Crystal sometimes is a little bit slowish if your program is very large. And
Mhm.
so one of the first things that I ran into was realizing that, oh, I don't actually need to compile my program. I just need to, have the compiler check it for errors, which is vastly
Oh.
faster than actually compiling it.
Hmm.
Because until all of the compiler errors are cleared, it's not going to run anyway. So it doesn't need to go do all the code generation. I can, so you can tell Crystal,
Oh.
so you can tell Crystal to do everything but the code generation. The code generation is what takes all the time. So
Yeah.
so then even a big piece of software, you can go check for compile errors in a couple of seconds. And
Oh, okay.
once I had that sort of aha moment for that, then it really wasn't that much different than how I do Ruby. I
Huh.
go work on something, then I go check, okay, what's still breaking? Okay, go work on some stuff and then go check what's still breaking until I get to the point where the compiler doesn't give me any errors. And then at that point in time, let's actually, fully compile it and run it and see what happens.
I am super into that idea. How'd you do that? Like, I mean, what's your process? I'm assuming the CLI has some
There's a
ability.
no code gen. It's just that simple. There's a no code gen
Oh my
flag.
gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man. All right. Well, I'm definitely gonna
Yeah.
update my process to use that. So, what was kind of your first project? What was your kind of your onboarding experience, as it were, into the language?
Well, so I have a thing that I wrote in Ruby a bunch of years ago. So actually, going back to Iowa and the fact that I was using Iowa for all of these production web applications, and I got this idea around I don't know 2007 2008 that it would be really nice if I had a load balancer that would work with Iowa. And the thing about Iowa is that it kept track of session information server side,
Hmm.
which there's definitely some pros and cons there. One of the pros is that the web framework then made it stupid easy to deal with, forms and params and all that stuff. Basically, you didn't have to worry about it. It just worked.
Hmm.
But the con is that if you have, say, multiple servers, you have to make sure that all of the requests for a given session always end up back with the same process
Hmm.
because that's where your session lives. And so I wrote a load balancing reverse proxy in Ruby for Iowa. And then I got, the other thing that you deal with, of course, is logs. And if you have application uh, server processes running in multiple places on multiple servers, multiple instances, and you have to debug something, it's a real pain to have to telnet or SSH into
Yep.
umpteen different machines and go look through your logs and try and figure out, all right, which log file has the errors that I'm looking for to figure out my problem. And so I wanted a way to just aggregate all my logs in one place that was not negatively impacting the performance of the application. And so I wrote a log aggregator that was a very fast asynchronous log aggregator in Ruby, and use these things in production forever. I mean, there's still dozens of sites that I built that are using these things in production. Nobody knows. They sit there and they run and they work.
Is this ANA logger?
Analogger, yep,
ANA logger. Oh, okay.
yep,
Yeah.
asynchronous logger.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, and so I thought, you know what? Why don't I try you know, rewriting Analogger in Crystal? And so that was the first, I guess, real project, is just working through rewriting that in Crystal.
Okay. And this is not like a simple project. I mean, there were, you're doing kind of fault tolerance, you're storing things locally if you can
Yeah,
to recover. I mean, can you
yeah,
go over some of the challenges in both in this project and how Crystal might have done well or not done well and
yeah,
kind of solving
yeah.
these?
So I mean, this was one of the things where Crystal helped me discover that there are some bugs in the Ruby side, and they aren't serious bugs because like I'd never tripped over them in actual production, but I discovered that they existed. So yeah, I mean, basically the idea with Analoger is that you have a central server that aggregates logs, and you can have n clients that all connect to it and feed logs to it. And it was written using Event Machine so that
Oh.
everything runs in an event loop. Since it's dealing with logs is all I/O. You know, event-based processing is extremely fast with things that are I/O bound,
Hmm.
and so Analoger, at its core, it's really a fairly simple thing. Receive messages, figure out where they need to go, which bucket they need to be dumped into, and dump them into that bucket.
Hmm.
And then on the client side, there's a little bit of sophistication there because I wanted it to be fault tolerant to the server going down or network failures or something like that. And so on the client side, it will, if it loses contact with its server, it will spool all of those logging messages locally. And then when it gets access again, it will start unspooling them. But
Yep.
it
Yep.
keeps the chronological order. So even while it's unspooling them off of the file system, new logging messages don't go to the Analoger server before all of the old stuff is unspooled off the file system, so that you can maintain that chronological order of delivery.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of it in a nutshell. And it's one of those things that is in production usage, it just hums along and it just works. And Ruby gets knocks for being slow, but Analoger, in using Event Machine, even on older hardware, it had absolutely no problem accepting more logs than you could actually send over your Ethernet connection. I mean, it would completely saturate your connection and still be able to handle the load. So performance wise, it was
Okay.
great.
That is super cool. And I feel like this kind of dovetails really well into Minion because
Yeah,
it seems like Minion has a lot of the same kind of concepts. Can you
yeah.
kind of fill us in on Minion?
So yeah, and so Minion's kind of, I guess it's maybe a little bit less secret now after this podcast. But so
Sorry.
I work for Josh Software now, which is a software consultancy service company. And actually, like the week that I was hired, they were doing a hackathon, and the basic concept of the hackathon was for teams of people to get together and come up with something, whether it was a product pitch or an actual product, come up with something that could be demoed, and then Josh would if these things were compelling enough, see if some of those things could actually get some resources to be built. And so I jumped onto a team with another guy someone that I actually used to work with at Engineard, who was also working for Josh.
Hmm.
J. Austin Huey. He had a idea for a product that he had in his head for a long time, and basically, it was it's a tool for managing servers. It's a tool for making certain DevOps things easier, basically. And so I kind of jumped onto that, and I did all of for the hackathon. I did the whole UI layer. I wrote a UI in React to demo what it might look like, basically.
Hmm.
And the end result of the hackathon was the that this looked compelling and this looked interesting, and basically, why don't you go see if you can figure out a plan to deliver an MVP and start working on it. And so, sort of the nutshell version is that I've spent, well, most of my time between then and now working on it. And yeah, it started out literally. It's because I had done the crystal version of Analoger. Yeah, I realized that, oh, hey, what I already wrote here delivers kind of a core of the capabilities. I forked off of that and worked on using that to build a whole client server structure for, you know, basically what the minions are is it's an agent that lives out on your server, your instance, whatever you want to manage and monitor, and it will collect metrics, it'll collect logs, and it will stream them all back to the Minion server. But then it also has a management component where it can receive commands and things like that from the server back to your instances, so that you can do management type stuff all off of a UI or a CLI centrally. And so it's a way just of aggregating logs and metrics on your systems into a central place, and then do management back to those systems from that central place, all encrypted over TLS and secure.
Yeah.
And that's basically what it is. And so right now we're hammering to finish up an MVP of it.
It's super cool. It's just like Analog or plus plus. It's got a
Yeah.
lot of really cool ideas in there, including it has somewhat is the. I noticed there were some things about networks and some things about server failures. Like
Yeah.
it seems way more fault tolerant. Is it more fault tolerant than Analogger?
Well, so it's basically the same concepts of fault tolerance. So, let's say you have some appliance that is in a lab somewhere, or whatever. You have some appliance sitting somewhere, and you need to monitor it.
Mm-hmm.
But it may be on an internet connection that is unreliable. So what the agent will do is it'll sit there and it'll collect all of its metrics, all of the, whatever telemetry it's been told to collect, whatever logs it's been told to collect. It'll collect them all and it'll stream them to the central server. If that unreliable internet connection goes down, then it starts spooling them locally. And
Okay.
then whenever that connection comes back up, it'll unload them back to the server seamlessly. So you don't notice anything. That it all just runs. Nothing changes from an operational point of view. It's just that when that internet connection comes back, the data goes back up to the server, and if it goes away again, no worries. We'll just start spooling locally again until it comes back again.
Okay. There's like a few different things that I'm like really interested about. So what about the is this similar? I guess the REPL, the interactive REPL, is it like a multi SSH session, or is there something more advanced? Like
So the initial the initial product is not a multi SSH, just because that has some interesting issues that have to be solved, that are out of scope for basically the time frame that I have to develop this in.
got it.
So one of the issues, just by the way, Crystal doesn't have, as far as I've been able to discern, any sort of good PTY implementation. So
Interesting.
in order to do something like where you set up an interactive, multi SSH type of thing, you want to be able to run PTY so that you can have, what looks to the remote system like a shell with all of the resources that are available.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not available. And I looked at it and was like, okay, I don't have time to write this. So what it does is it manages it has a command queue, basically. So let's say you have some set of servers and you want to issue a command to all of them.
Yep.
You from the UI point of view, you go and there's various ways that you can query the servers, and you can select the set that you want, because servers can be tagged with various tags that describe what they're for, what they're doing, etc. And so in some way you select the set of servers that you want to act on, and then you provide a command. And what happens is that the command goes into a Postgres database, and
Yep.
we're actually using Postgres then as a messaging bus.
Oh, how so?
using the notification capabilities in Postgres.
Oh man, I've wanted to try that out. I've
Yeah,
yet to actually try that feature, but I keep on reading about it. Like it just,
it
I
works
haven't found a
really
good
well.
excuse to use it.
Yeah,
Okay,
it works
that's
really well.
awesome.
And
It's good to hear.
so basically what happens is, all the data goes into the database, and then the the Minion stream server just has a notification channel with the database. And when that
Oh,
notification goes out, it triggers that notification to go back down to the stream server. And there's, because of the beautiful way that fibers work with Crystal, that notification is picked up, and using channels, basically
interesting.
there's a signal that goes out internally that says, okay, go pull the list of servers and dispatch the command to all of them.
All
And
right, I'm
so the commands fire out to however many servers there are, and there's essentially a fiber for each one that then waits for it to finish, collects all of the standard out and standard error, and queues it back into the database. And it also does
interesting.
deduplication, essentially, of the output. So if everything returns the same output, you're only going to get like one record in the database. And all of the way the data structure is set up for the command output, if it's all the same, it's all going to point to that one record, so you don't duplicate data. But then if it diverges, you get more messages
Got
back.
it.
Diverge the data, then it'll make new ones.
That's fascinating. I love that. That is super cool. I really want to read more about that. I'll have to like dig through it a little bit. It is open source, at least through what I've been looking at, or it's
So
public on
yeah,
GitHub.
right now parts of it are open source and parts of it aren't.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a library of just sort of common things that are shared between the agent and the server that is open
Yep.
source, and the agent is open source. The server is not currently open source.
That makes sense.
That's sort of a business decision whether or not it
Sure.
ends up being open source or not. But the other parts are open source right now. Yeah.
That makes sense. And then you talking about this a little bit. I noticed that there was a shard you chose. I keep on wanting to say gem. I totally know what I'm talking about, but at the same time, like gem just comes so quickly to my mouth. But you're using concurrent, which is a crystal shard that uses mostly fibers and channels under the hood, but provides a really good interface for concurrency.
Yeah.
It is super awesome. It's super easy. I actually think if someone's just starting out, it's a really good starter point. Although the Crystal concurrent like the tools in Crystal, I enjoy using. But talking about some of the mutex or some of the fibers and some of the things you did, is any of that kind of a byproduct of like, are you using the concurrent Crystal a lot for that? And
So
did you find it?
there's actually just one piece of concurrent that I'm using.
Oh,
Yeah, so concurrent has it's got like a bunch of different little functions that are built into the library. And one of the functions allows you to parallelize stream processing and things like that
mm-hmm.
very easily. The syntax is just beautifully simple. And so that's the bit that I'm using.
Oh, okay. And all right. That's really interesting. And then there were some interesting choices that I just wanted to talk to you about, especially after talking about Kansas.
Mhm.
You are you planning on using an ORM, or what was your thoughts around that? It seems like it was kind of developed a little differently.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of curious.
so right now I'm not using an ORM, mostly because it was not. It's one of those things that it's not super clear to me. I've done some research into the Crystal ORMs, but it's not super clear to me what the right decision is.
I know, it's like
It,
crazy.
yeah, so
Yeah.
the database is Postgres, and
Yep.
so we're using some Postgres capabilities like JSON columns and TS vectors for full text stuff.
Oh, I did.
Yeah, and so it's an easy thing to use an ORM if you're just sort of doing vanilla queries, vanilla inserts, that sort of thing. But when you start getting into things like doing TS queries for full text stuff,
Yeah.
that sort of narrows your scope a lot. And there are a couple of ORMs for Crystal that Clear supports it,
I love Clear. It's super fun.
and and I think Avram supports it too, but I'm not 100% sure. But Clear definitely does. But mostly it was just one of those things where the database stuff. Yeah, I'm not afraid of writing SQL, and
That's good to
the
know.
database stuff is it's pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
It doesn't change a lot, so I didn't see a lot of benefit in even worrying about an ORM. I'll just write some SQL and it's all good.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I have stepped up my SQL game a lot in the past year, but I don't know. I touched SQL kind of in the beginning of my career, stopped for a really long time because Active Record just made it so easy. But I've worked with people on varying ends of the spectrum. I've worked with people that believe SQL will become obsolete and interfaces over it will overtake it. And then I've actually worked with a few people that believe that ORM should not be necessary in any application, and just writing your SQL and code will, kind of,
Yeah.
is not. It's an interesting where ORMs fit. You've written one, or
Yeah.
you've taken over one, so it is an interesting spot.
And for me, one of the things, ORMs make a lot of things easier when you're writing code. I mean, even if you're adept at using SQL, ORMs still generally make it easier. But if you start getting into complex queries and things like that, ORMs can also make things vastly slower, depending upon what it is you're
Yeah.
dealing with.
Have you seen a performance difference between Active Record and Avram?
And everything in Crystal's faster. I mean,
Yeah, that's true too.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I was going to give you an example.
Yeah.
I was working
Go
on
ahead.
an application last year where the front end in React, back end was Rails.
Mhm.
And the application had to load a whole bunch of data from the database that, both there was a large volume of data, and the data had to be, you were joining data from multiple tables.
Okay.
And so the original implementation of all of this was utilizing Active Record. And so Active Record would go pull this data in, and then you would do Ruby stuff to construct the actual shape of the records that you want to pass off to your React front end, dump it as JSON and send it up.
Mhm.
Problem was that for a large data set, this took like 2 minutes, which is not viable when you're talking about web application responsiveness.
Yeah. Generally, browsers time out by then.
So what I ended up doing, we were using Postgres, there too, is Postgres can generate JSON natively. And so instead of using Active
Oh.
Record, I rewrote the query. And I mean, this resulted in, a page and a half of just ugly, hard to read SQL. But what took 2 minutes going through Active Record and Ruby to spit the JSON back to React, if I let Postgres do it all, it took like 300 milliseconds.
Whoa. That's fast.
Yeah. And so, that was a case where it was a profound win to go back to the database, let the database do what the database is good at, and just bite the bullet, deal with the really hideously ugly, hard to wrap your brain around in one go chunk of SQL, but write it, develop it, and then let the database do what it's good at.
Yeah, there is something about the change and kind of like mindset I've had since the Rails, like since I was, exclusively Rails, which is that the database has a lot of really good functionality and a lot of really good features to use. And like I used to do everything in Ruby, validations in Ruby, all this other stuff, and you knew there were like uniqueness to know, there was like some like, okay, well, in that edge case kind of thing. But working more and more with the database, it really does empower a lot of features, and it makes you think about things differently. It gives you more tools in your toolbox, and it allows for some things that just couldn't be done before. And there's both performance gains, like what you're talking about, but the deeper I get into databases, the more I realize that a bunch of functionalities and features are derived from the database.
Yeah, and there are things that databases are good at, and like everything else, you're balancing pros and cons. You're trading off, one aspect versus another. And when you're using an ORM, most of the time you're using an ORM because as a programmer, it makes it faster to write the code and to get something that works. And in a lot of cases, the performance difference is not significant enough to care about. It gets lost in the noise. But whether it's performance related or it's capability related, sometimes there are just things that make more sense to sacrifice a little bit of that programmer immediate productivity for long-term program productivity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I guess I have a question for you, which is, if an ORM achieved the feature set that you need for the Minion server, would an ORM be the right choice? Like, is it something where
Yeah.
it would be?
Yeah, I think so. If the feature set was there and using the ORM didn't introduce other complexities,
Mhm.
then absolutely it would be a good choice. It's again it's just that balancing of
Yeah.
competing interests. And if an ORM makes it easier for me to write the code and it still delivers all the features and it still delivers all the performance, then at that point there's no downside.
And you were saying with Kansas that the ORM was kind of database up. That
Yes.
like it would, yeah, that's very interesting. Avram has a sanitizing checker, but it doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't call it like database up. I wonder if ORMs in any language, but specifically thinking about Crystal, if you could parse some of the structure SQL and create something akin to that in Crystal, just making sure that everything is derived from the bottom up. I'm not really sure that I haven't really seen that in other ORMs, but I haven't seen Kansas either.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, and I think, the way Kansas worked is not the way most ORMs worked. I mean, most of the, as far as just philosophically, ORMs all seem to take the point of view that the code defines the database. And so, whatever your classes are, or however the ORM is working, that defines the structure for the database. And yeah, Kansas just did it the opposite way. It said, okay, let's go look at the database and let's take that structure and let's map that back to Ruby objects.
That's super fascinating. I'm definitely gonna have to go hunt that down and take a good look at it. I feel like we missed a lot of your contributions to Ruby, and I think that like it'd be really good to get you back on sometime and go through some of that. I also just would love to hear more about your ideas about the kind of the ORM space and kind of the Crystal space in general, possibly even about what Iowa would look like in the Crystal space and kind of web servers and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully, if we get you back, it'll be after you've deployed Minion, so we can hear kind of your war stories.
It's Minion is one of those things that we've got a fairly aggressive timeline on it to get an MVP delivered, but hopefully that will be coming together into a full-fledged product here pretty soon. My time actually right now is being spent largely writing React to do all of the UI work for the front end, because the back end side with Crystal and the stream server and the agent and everything, that's all working great. And so now we just have to get a UI that makes it easy for people to utilize all those capabilities.
Awesome. Yeah, React is definitely taken over the space. We'll have to chat more about that later. If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
So I'm wyhaines everywhere.
Okay.
Yep, literally. It was one of those things that back when I was thinking, okay, what handles should I use on like Twitter and things like that? There are a few other Kirk Haineses in the world, or a few other K Haineses in the world. But Wyoming Haines, well, that's unique. So I'm W.Y. Haines on GitHub. I'm W.Y. Haines on Twitter. I'm W.Y. Haines everywhere.
Awesome. And is there any projects that you would maybe if there are people able to contribute that you would like to shout out?
Gosh, I haven't even really thought about that much. I think that at a point in the not too distant future, when Minion has reached full MVP status, it might be something that's interesting for people who are interested in Crystal to take a look at and improve. Because while I've been deep into doing everything in Crystal here for the last month and a half, it's still my first real product in Crystal, and so I know that there's things that I did that were stupid. But other than that, as far as just like sort of wish list type things, one of the things that I've wanted to do for years is to take Iowa and rewrite it, basically, given all of the developments that have happened in the last almost 20 years of Ruby. I still think that it's a interesting web framework that makes a lot of things really, really simple. And
awesome.
I've written lots of Rails stuff in my career, but every time I'm writing Rails stuff, I'm always thinking, gosh, this would be so much easier if I were using Iowa.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, for those who are looking, those are both on GitHub, or will be and are. And I am Jack Thorne with Chicago Crystal. I'm generally 123 on the internet, or WONTRUEFREE. And Chicago Crystal is on Twitter right now at Twitter Chicago_Crystal, and we are trying to get the YouTube name for it. I think we've only had 2 or 3 talks upload to YouTube, but we're almost to the point where we can claim the name on YouTube. So if you can subscribe, that'd be awesome. And thank you for listening to Chicago Crystal. And we will be here, and please come back soon. A big thank you to our producer, Christy Flores, who edits these podcasts, and our DJ, Bill Wesley, who provides the tracks and samples for these episodes. This was an episode of Chicago Crystal, building community and getting stuff made in our favorite language. We'll see you soon.